Carmody is a neuroscientist, and he works hand in hand with Father McCarthy to relate how our brain works together with what Father McCarthy has been saying, and I think you'll find it very interesting. And I forgot to mention this morning that Father McCarthy's, for those of you who weren't here last night perhaps, Father McCarthy's wife, Mary, is here with us too, and we're very glad she's here. John, it's all yours.
Well, this probably wasn't imaginable until you heard Father McCarthy's lecture. So if the entity that brought the universe into existence says, love one another as I have loved you, and that love is completely devoid of any sense of violence or aggression, retaliation, revenge, etc., this starts to make sense. You know, forget survival of the fittest. It is kindness that counts. Now, where did the word survival of the fittest come from? Did it come from Darwin? No. Did it come from an English philosopher? Yes. Actually, Darwin only used that phrase twice, and he apologized for using it the first time, and it still appeared again. So Darwin, in all his research, looking at primarily mammals as well as other organisms, but this part is focused on the conclusions that he came as a result of listening to the intense care and kindness and compassion that mammals gave to their offspring. So it transcends the kind of care that other lower animals actually initiate toward their offspring. And so when Darwin talks about survival of the fittest, he's talking about the ability of offspring to not only survive, but also to thrive. So what's the difference between thriving and surviving? Well, there's a great deal of difference. Just being alive is one thing. Being alive enough to experience the fullness of what it is to be alive, with all the capacities that we have as human beings, all these innate capacities that come with the mammalian brain that we're born with. So we're really talking about 30 million years of development of the genes that we have on our chromosomes up to this present moment in time. There is a tendency, because of the pronounced effect that Hobbesian evolutionary psychology has had on thinking today, primarily in the media and among the military and among individuals and groups that are actually proponents of violence and aggression as means of achieving ends. So with agape, the means become the ends in embryo. So if you're kind and caring and compassionate, then the ends of that particular behavior are going to be the elicitation of kindness, care, and compassion by the individuals you're interacting with. And I'm really talking specifically about the first 3 years of life as far as the child is concerned, and the experiences that child has that determine the structure and function of the brain. So you can change the nature of what it means to be human just by early developmental experiences that the child has. So the brain, from the time it begins to function as an organ until the time you die, remains plastic. That is, it can always change. So when we hear put on the mind of Christ, we're not talking about putting on the mind of Napoleon. We're not talking about putting on the mind of someone that's a Marine platoon commander in Vietnam. We're talking about putting on a mind that's consistent with agape. And theologically, there are three primary components of agape. One is the willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation. So as soon as you believe that, then you have to forget about the whole idea of using any kind of aggressive means in order to achieve an end. It's also the willingness to serve without the desire for reciprocation. So I don't need a $10 billion salary every year to be a good corporate executive, while people in my corporation are getting $7.25 an hour and have to work 2 jobs other than the one that they have with me in order to just survive. So there are some dynamics that are going on here that are extremely important, and we'll explore a lot of those this afternoon in the second presentation, but also get a start on it in this morning's presentation. There. All right, nature or nurture. So there's a perception now that nature, in some people's minds, dominates the way human beings are going to interact with one another. So we have a human nature. That is, if we give the brain what it needs in order to develop, that we'll have a certain nature, and that would be X. Now, the key there is if we give the brain what it needs to develop the way it should develop, literally, which is putting on the mind of Christ, because if you look at neuroscience today, they say literally that the primary default responses of the human brain to other people in the society that they're living in are care, compassion, kindness, understanding, mercy. Nothing in the realm of violence or aggression. So, I mean, this is what the neuroscientists are saying. And some of that first diagram came from an article that was written by a researcher at the University of California at Berkeley. And he wrote an extensive article that was published in Nature Neuroscience, which is one of the big top neuroscience journals in the country. And he was talking about a number of ways that the brain can be influenced by the environment that a person is immersed in. So we're going to just spend a few minutes on this nature versus nurture component of development. So this is a strand of DNA. They call it a double helix because it's like 2 strands intertwined with one another. And in that DNA, if you look at these, let's say we look at this section of the molecule right here, this short chain of that molecule could actually encode for a specific protein. So this is what all the DNA does. It just tells the cell how to put amino acids together, which are the building blocks of proteins, in order to make specific proteins that the body needs. So the proteins are the big regulators in the body. So in order to do that, this code must be copied, and then there's a mechanism outside the cell where the protein is actually synthesized. So if you interfere with what's going on here, then that gene will not be expressed. If the gene was not structured the way it should have been to begin with as a result of some genetic deformation in the developmental process, then it wasn't there to begin with. But they have found that human beings, by the way they interact with one another, can actually change the expression of a gene. So let's say that this gene right here was necessary in order to respond appropriately to a stressful situation, and then, if in fact the stressful situation has been managed, that you could come out of that high stress condition. They have found that children that are abused or neglected have a higher rate of suicide when they are in their teen years and adolescent years. Okay? So what happened when they first started thinking about this, the initial research was done in rats, and they found that rats that licked and groomed their offspring a lot had offspring that were very calm and very social. So they were able to get along with other pups that they played with during the day. And then they found that, well, this was transgenerational. So when those pups grew up and they had offspring, that those offspring were the same, much different from some of the other rats that were in the study that were not raised in thriving environments that included lots of licking and grooming, touching, and things like that. So then they started looking at, for example, stressed teenagers, adolescents. And then they started looking at the possibility that some of the things that were going on early in their life might have an effect on their proclivity to actually commit suicide. And so they got a cohort of brains of adolescents who had committed suicide. They did the brain slices, and they actually found an area of the brain, which is the hippocampus, which is the area of the brain that starts the initiation of memory. So memory is encoded, and then it's actually stored, consolidated in a higher part of the brain. So this hippocampus is in the lower part of the brain, and it has to have like these little receptors in it that when they sense a high level of cortisol in the blood, which is a major stress hormone. So when someone gets stressed out, they have this hormone in the blood. If that stays at high levels, it's actually toxic to the brain. It will actually kill parts of the brain. It's toxic to the nerve cells in the brain. So over the life of this child that's been abused and neglected, they have these high levels of cortisol, which really impairs brain development. So not only are they more sensitive to going into a stressful response, but it takes them longer before they actually get out of that stressful response. So what they found was that the brains of the adolescents who had committed suicide had fewer of these receptors that turned off the stress response. So developmentally, they were unable to control their depression, unable to control their sense of not being worthwhile, et cetera, et cetera. So the dynamics of the environment that the individual is raised in, particularly in those first 3 years, will hold sometimes through the entire life of that child. So this is important. So this is important primarily if you look at, for example, when I was in Vietnam and I was looking at what were happening to the children, looking at what happened to the grandmothers and grandfathers and the homes and the rice paddies and all the destruction around these young children. Not only were they being killed and burned, but they were being left without parents. They were being left without grandmothers and grandfathers. They were being left without homes. They were being left without food supply. They were being left without their water buffaloes. They were being left without their chickens. I don't know if you've heard about the latest book that was written by an author who did extensive research on the militarization of Vietnam by the United States. His name was Nick Terse. And the title of the book is Kill Anything That Moves. The word on the ground for some of the troops, for some of the units in Vietnam was literally that, kill anything that moves. So they could come into a village unprovoked, kill every chicken, every cow, every water buffalo, destroy the rice paddies, kill women, children, grandmothers, grandfathers, etc., and leave the village and say, mission accomplished. So what kind of mind do you have to have if you're willing to participate in that? And a lot of the troops weren't willing to participate in it because we have a chain of command in the military that if they don't obey a direct order, let's say I'm a platoon commander and I give them a direct order to fire at that village or call in an airstrike and the chopper comes in and sprays machine gun fire and rockets on that village, he's got to obey my direct order. If it's someone on the ground and they refuse my direct order, I am authorized to actually kill that person. Just like in World War II, the penalty for not reporting to duty if you were called to join the German army was decapitation, that your head chopped off. That's an incentive to join. So this is what we're talking about, with the violence and the threat and the aggression, getting people to participate in experiences that are causing them severe brain damage. Now, when you're going to Iraq and you have 3 tours of duty there, and then you start in Afghanistan, you have 2 tours there, 3 tours in Iraq. Can you imagine the stress that individual is under? And a lot of them were coming back and they were reporting, the problems that they were having, psychological problems. And so the primary function of the psychologists in the military, as it's always been, is force multipliers. So we want to get this guy back out in the field, let's get him back out there. So even though they weren't ready to go back, they'd send them for another tour to Afghanistan, then maybe 3 tours to Afghanistan after they already had 2 tours in Iraq. So you have 5, some of them 6 or 7 tours of duty in the period of those 2 wars. Now that is asking for severe brain damage. There's just no way you can have those high stress levels that are involved in combat situations, or just being away from home and being in a foreign environment and not having a safe place to go day in and day out. You're always under threat depending upon what kind of unit you're in and what your mission assignment is. So when those guys come back, their brain structure and brain chemistry has changed. There's absolutely no way around it. There's no way around it, because the brain is an internal reflection of the external environment. And we'll talk about that. The way your brain is set up, the molecules that are active in that brain, the neurons that are active in that brain, the neurohormones that are active in that brain, the ions that are active in that brain, the processes that the neurons are undergoing in order that they can develop and have functional neural networks primarily involved with memory, muscle memory, cognitive memory, et cetera, behaviors. These are not functioning the way they need to be. And so there's deprivation as far as the ability to become the mind of Christ. It seems the most dissonant thing you can imagine is to put on the mind of Christ after you've been all through this and your mind is like scrambled. And you've had brain destruction as a result of all this stress that you've been exposed to. So the question remains, nature or nurture. So let's just take a look at a couple things that are known. One is that the line between nature and nurture has dissolved into experience-dependent neuroplasticity. So my brain changes in response to the experiences that I have. So if you go back to the gatherer-hunter communities, they used to call them hunter-gatherers, but they found out that most of the time was spent gathering. They weren't running around with spears chasing each other and trying to kill them. They were gathering crops and gathering things they needed to sustain the family. And during this period of time, which was 99% of our existence, there was almost never any individual killing. So if I'm a human being, a Homo sapien sapien, and you're a Homo sapien sapien, that means we are conspecifics. We are members of the same species. There is no species in existence in the entire world, as we know it today, the Earth, that kills a conspecific intentionally. I mean, you see movies of elk, running together and crashing into one another, and you see piranha whipping their tails and having their little skirmishes, and you see rattlesnakes wrestling with one another. But it's never to the death. It's never to the death unless, it's almost like accidental, like, it was a hard headbutt that, I don't know, just for some reason there was a problem with the other elk and his skull fractured and he was killed. But this is unheard of in the animal kingdom. Killing of conspecifics. And we have developed the most sophisticated mechanisms imaginable for doing that. So the neuroplasticity that means that the brain can always be changed. And you know that if you've learned how to type. You've learned that if you learned how to hit a fastball. You've learned that if you know how to shoot a fall shot without, freaking out because of the pressure. It's the shot that's going to win the game. I mean, there's a lot of stress there. But if you do that enough, then you know how to manage that. You actually can bring down your blood pressure. You can increase your concentration. You can breathe. That helps to relax. So there's a number of different mechanisms that we have, and all these get built into the brain. And the more we do it, the more the brain changes to reflect the pattern of activation that was necessary in order for the person to keep his arm relaxed so he could put enough spin on the ball and flick his wrist hard enough in order to make the foul shot. So until the day we die, we're plastic. So you can always change, always room for change, and the brain will accommodate that. As long as there's patterned, repetitive kinds of training that go into that, or activities. So the more you're empathic to other people, the more those areas of the brain develop. There are 10 areas of the brain now that have been identified as sources of empathy in human situations. So that the more empathic you are to other people, the more frequently you do that, the more those areas develop. And now that we have this wonderful technology called functional MRI, you can actually go in and look at someone's brain and expose them to different situations and see how they manage it. And there's a difference because developmentally, you can see that there's activity in certain areas of the brain for someone that has been in, like they have an induced stress response. In other words, the person is having an MRI, so they do something that's stressful to that individual, and they're looking to see what happens. And so there are certain areas of the brain that light up as a result of that. And they found that, people, for example, that participate in breath awareness or mindfulness meditation or centering prayer, actually those areas become more developed than they are in a normal individual. And as a result of that, the response, to that stress is different. And that can actually be recorded live by looking at a functional MRI. It doesn't measure directly. It just measures the flow of blood into an area, which is equivalent to increased neural activity. Because the fMRI is really measuring electromagnetism, and oxygenated blood has a different response in an fMRI than unoxygenated blood. So they can tell the difference between a blood cell that's bringing in oxygen versus one that's taking away CO2 or carbon dioxide. Next, we have early life experiences determine core neurobiology. Now, no one knows this better than the American Pediatric Association. So they actually say, until a child is 2 years old, they recommend no screen time. This includes iPad, iPod, iTouch, iPhone, any of those devices that have a screen. Because the vast majority of the brain for young infants and children is devoted to social experiences. And an iPad is not a social experience, nor is an iPhone, nor is a television screen. It demands intense human interaction with other persons. This is why when they look at the gatherer-hunter societies, they find that there's extended families, that one child may be nurtured by 20 or 30 different individuals. And since the collective is primarily interested in cooperation, and there's not this dissonance that you get when some people are trying to maintain, their fiefdom or their wealth, because there was no such thing. The crops grew, and then they ate, and then the next round of harvest came in, and there wasn't massive storage like eventually happened with the advance of culture and technology. But what they're talking about here in the early phases of, not even an early, but we're looking at 30 million years. For most of that time, it was intense cooperation, because intense cooperation was necessary in order for the whole band to, in fact, survive. Now it's not. I mean, we can have our home and we can have our wealth, and we don't really daily, constantly think about someone like, for example, if you have a grandson or a granddaughter and you see someone on the street and this mother's foraging for food and her little 2-year-old's hanging on to her leg, you don't have the same response to that. I mean, you may feel empathic. So there's the feeling of empathy, but empathy also includes actually doing something. So if, in fact, you knew that there was a shelter that could rectify that situation or improve it a little bit, and you went that step, that would be a true empathic act. And an area of your brain, one of those areas that's involved in empathy, actually then has a greater capacity to not only do that again, but possibly think of ways to do it better or do it more thoroughly. So interactions with caregivers during early development establish the brain's cognitive, that is the intelligence part, but also the emotional circuitry. So you're hardwiring your child's brain as you nurture them. So you're building neural circuits. So what happens if you don't do that? What happens if the infant doesn't get the stimulation that he or she needs? Well, one of the classic examples of that are the Romanian orphans. And some of those orphans were adopted by Americans. And there was one case I knew of that was I knew about the whole thing because there was a neuropsychiatrist that was actually eventually called in. And the young boy was fine. I think they got him when he was like 1 year old. And then when he was 5 years old, he just became extremely aggressive. In fact, he was beating up their daughter, who was a couple years older. And it just took intensive therapy in order to get the child so he could actually go back to school. I mean, in the film, they had the mother holding him down just to restrain him until she was exhausted. And then the father had to come in and lay on top of him until, eventually the boy calmed down. So there is a number of different mechanisms that you can use, and this neuropsychiatrist really had some of them because he had actually adopted 4 orphans himself, the family had. So he had a repertoire of ways to manage what was going on. So this is, the caregivers are important. They're the most important people in the society. More important than corporate executives, more important than the military, more important than anything. Just this one-to-one interaction between one human being and another. Because it determines, as we say above, core neurobiology. Now, this is an experiment that was done that was trying to tease apart nature versus nurture. And this is a mammal similar to, for example, a rat as far as brain structure is concerned, which is fairly evolved. So let me just go over this and then we'll show you the experiment. So this is what they did. They were interested in knowing how plastic neurons really are. And if where they go and the milieu and the environment they're surrounded in really determines what they become. So if I have neurons from the brain going to my eyes, what would happen if I took those neurons and I put them in my auditory area where my hearing nerves were supposed to go? What would they develop into? Would they still maintain the capacity for vision, or would they actually be transformed into neurons that could interpret incoming sound waves from the eardrum? So basically, just to outline it, here's the optic nerve. So this is what goes out of the back of our eyeball to the occipital lobe in the brain. So this is from both sides. And then they cross over, so your right eye goes to the left side, the left eye goes to the right side. And the area that the nerves actually grow into is called the visual cortex. So one of the first things that these neurons need, after the baby's born, is light. So this is an incoming sensation. Everything we perceive is through our senses. So all the knowledge we have in our brain, all the theorems, all the relationships come through, the experiences that we're getting. So if a baby is born with a cataract, let's say on the left eye, they have to actually correct that visual defect within the first 3 months. Because if they don't do it, what happens is, these nerves are growing from the back of the eye to the right side of the brain. And the stimulus that makes them grow, just like if I want to do, I want to increase the size of my bicep, I got to do curls, and I have to increase the weight, and eventually I have a bigger bicep or a stronger bicep. So the same thing with vision. And then the light hits the eye, and then the neurons grow, and they go from one side to the other. So they go from here all the way back to the visual cortex, and this same thing. So this is where they connect. So what happens is if the baby doesn't have enough light, is that if this was, for example, the eye on this side, and it was going to this side of the brain, and this was the one that had the cataract, what would happen is that this tract, this optic nerve tract, would actually not only grow into this area, but, not only grow into that area, but it would also grow into this area. So there's competition. So you see how important experience is to actually determining whether or not the infant's going to see. And they have to do it quickly because in a relatively short period of time, this area will be taken over, and even if the eye has normal vision, it won't be able to connect. The thing with this experiment, though, they were wondering what happens if we force those nerves to go over here to what's called the auditory or the hearing cortex. What would happen? And they were able to actually interpret the results based upon different angles of formation on a device they were using to actually connect the visual imprint on the optic nerve itself. So they had some oblique, angles, and those are encoded in red. The vertical ones are encoded in blue. Then the green ones are oblique, and the horizontal ones are in yellow. So if we take a look then at this question, can nurture trump what nature intended? And this experiment was a classic that actually examined that whole thing. Is the volume up? The sound up?
To answer that question, neuroscientists turn to a small animal immortalized in a portrait by Leonardo da Vinci over 500 years ago. The ferret.
The most fundamental question in understanding how the brain develops has to be the interaction between nature and nurture. We know that the brain has different areas that do different things, such as the visual cortex at the back of the brain, or the auditory cortex in the middle of the brain. How do these areas get to be where they are, and how do they do what they end up doing in the adult?
How plastic is the brain? How flexible? Can nurture trump what nature intended? In a series of elegant experiments, neuroscientist Mriganka Sir restructured the brains of newborn ferrets. In the normal ferret, light striking the eye creates electrical waves that travel to the visual cortex. Sir rewired the ferret's brain, hooking up the eyes to the auditory cortex, showering the hearing parts of the brain with electric waves generated by the light.
We reasoned that if we can make visual inputs from the eye go to the auditory cortex that normally processes hearing, would the hearing cortex now become like a visual cortex or a seeing cortex if it grew up with vision rather than with audition? Would the hearing cortex now come to have the same circuits and connections that mark the visual cortex? If it doesn't, then nature or the genetic endowment is of the essence. If it does, then the inputs are important, or nurture is important, then the animal would see.
By recording a series of images directly from the brains of his rewired ferrets, Sir provided evidence that the ferrets could see. With normal ferrets, the activity of the neurons in the visual cortex takes on a characteristic pinwheel shape. With the rewired ferrets, the auditory cortex describes a similar pinwheel design. The brain has been transformed, but not entirely.
Instead of 20/20 vision, they will have, let's say, 20/60 vision, meaning that they see at 20 feet what a normal ferret would see at 60 feet.
The characteristic pinwheel is still there, but it is less orderly, slurred. Environment shapes the brain, but can't completely change genetic destiny.
Our experiments demonstrate beautifully, I think, the interaction of nature and nurture. I believe that the environment writes on a developing brain, but does not write on a blank slate. There is a structure that comes about due to genes, which then is influenced further by the environment that the brain is developing in. Our experiments provide very clear evidence of the remarkable plasticity of the brain.
All right, so we know that nurturing is important in early development, and what effect does it have on someone who is immersed in a terrifying, violent, extremely deprivational kind of environment that actually goes counter to the way in which the brain is designed to interact with other human beings. There's probably, if you were looking at the psychopathology of it, you would probably say there is no other kind of activity that is more destructive of the circuitry in the brain that's supposed to be the natural circuitry that endows us with the capacity for empathy and care and compassion, kindness, etc. So, how many of you have seen the TV program or heard of the TV program The Sopranos? So, I've heard of it. I never watched it, but I was interested in the death of James Gandolfini, who was the Godfather. There were two movies that came surfacing that he was the executive director of. One was Alive Memories, Home from Iraq, The Fight Has Just Begun. The other one was War Torn, that traced the history of post-traumatic stress disorder from the Civil War all the way through to interviews that he actually did in Iraq with people on active duty. And they described to him, explained to him, you know, the kind of treatment they were getting and how it wasn't helping, and they just wanted to get out of there and get back home and get into a setting and environment that wasn't so stressful and damaging, toxic. This is a toxic environment. You can't find a more toxic environment than a war zone. Okay, so it's after Vietnam where they were finding that the Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam was the same herbicide that was being sold for people to kill the weeds in their lawn. So it would kill dandelions, but it wouldn't kill the grass because one was a dicotyledon and the other was a monocotyledon, and this particular herbicide could distinguish the difference between it. So it wasn't the 2,4-D and 2,4-T that were causing the problems, which are the two active chemicals in most of the agents you put on your lawn to control your weeds. It was as a result of the manufacture of both of these products that there was a toxin produced that turned out to be the most toxic substance that was known to man at the time. It was called dioxin. Now that's in your weed control too. And when they checked it out, the concentration of dioxin in the herbicides that they used in Vietnam was 10,000 times higher than what was being used for home lawn care. So what they were thinking about is, well, we don't care about the Vietnamese. We don't care about the North Vietnamese or the South Vietnamese. But what they neglected to care about was the health consequences to the Marines and Air Force pilots that were flying the planes that were spraying the herbicide, to the Army, to anyone that was involved in Vietnam. So I was there in 67 and 68. I went back in 1992 and spent some time in Ho Chi Minh City, which used to be Saigon, and also in Hanoi, as well as at a base just along the DMZ, which is the base where I was actually stationed when I was in the Marine Corps. It was an area where we had put in innumerable landmines. And so the first part of my journey was 2 weeks in the Mekong Delta, which I was never near, but it was with Heifer International. And if you're familiar with Heifer International, it's an international organization that raises animals through a veterinary hospital usually, and then takes the animals and distributes them to poor rural farmers. So for us, it was taking cows out to rural farmers, and they try to make sure that the cow is actually pregnant. And these are all managed at the veterinary hospital, veterinary school of veterinary medicine in Saigon. So, I mean, they're healthy, and they train the peasants and the farmers how to actually care for the animal, how to feed it, how to make sure it has its immunizations, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I spent 2 weeks with my wife, Karen. She, was a intensive care nurse, and she had to go back home to go to work. But I went up to the base where it was actually Dong Ha was the city, and the base that was outside that was just totally excoriated. There was absolutely nothing but red clay you could see. And I was involved with a group called Peace Trees Vietnam that was doing reforestation, because they found that the canopy of the vegetation in Vietnam was necessary in order to increase the humidity over the rice paddies so they would get good yields from the rice that they were growing. And then they were also doing demining. And it was ironic because it was also sorrowful in the sense that I knew that those mines were mines that the units that were there, including ours, placed in the ground. And that they were still pulling them out of the ground, and they were still getting injuries and deaths from unexploded ordnance. So the first thing we did when we got there was the next morning we were supposed to go out and help plant trees. And there were some young students that were involved in this, junior high and early senior high. And so you're wondering what's going to happen when you go out, and here you are. So, we walk out into the field, and they kind of start to gather around you. And the first question they ask, have you ever been to Vietnam? And when you say yes, they say, you were here for the American War. They don't call it the Vietnam War, they call it the American War. And I didn't know if I could, first of all, I had all kinds of perceptions about how I would respond to this. They knew, because you were there doing what you were doing, that you were a different person than when you were there in 67 and 68. And they expressed, both by touch and by sight, because we couldn't really understand the language, just by looking into your face, that you were forgiven. I mean, this is an outpouring of compassion that was unimaginable. So all your fear and anxiety just dissipates, simply because you know that this individual somehow is interpreting your presence here as reconciliation, as a way of showing the Vietnamese people that you care about them. But they had transformed that whole base into a combination rubber plantation, coffee plantation, and pepper plantation. And the pepper I'm talking about is the condiment. There's a tree in Vietnam that, as it gets old, it sheds its overstory. So all you see is this like straight trunk sticking up out of the ground. And so they would dig a ditch around it and put buffalo dung in there, water buffalo dung, and then put pepper seeds in there, the condiment pepper. And then that pepper plant would completely entwine the tree, the trunk of the tree, so it looked like another tree almost. So they had really developed that area that if you came there, you wouldn't realize the destruction and devastation that was there before. or unless you knew that they were in fact involved in demining operations that were still going on there. So I just want to show you a little piece of this movie that Gandolfini was the executive director of. He interviewed a number of veterans, and what he did was just talk to them about their experiences. And he was incredible in the sense that he would just kind of lay back, and the person that directed it said that he never saw anyone be able to develop such rapport with individuals as Gandolfini was able to, because they recognized him as the Godfather. He's like their friend, because they had seen him on TV, and so they were really open with him. So we'll just do the first one. I think it takes about 3 or 4 minutes. But this just gives you some idea what these vets coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan have to deal with once they get home.
Laces. Wait for the slate, please. Wait for the slate.
And you're going to be facing straight ahead.
Everyone I've talked to knows the exact date when they've been hit.
Yeah, it's burned into your memory.
Yeah. A live day.
September 21st of 04 is when I got hit. But I guess it depends on how you consider it, because there's 3 times they tried flying me out, and all 3 times I died on a helicopter.
I feel like I'm not supposed to be here. My best friend was behind the driver, and he lost his life.
I always somehow see my picture on there where it should be January 2nd, 2005. Specialist Dexter, or PLC Dexter M. Pitts, killed in Baghdad.
I wake up and I thank God that I'm actually alive, and I pat myself on the back. I survived another day.
I mean, how many people can look at you and say, I just stared down with death and I won. And I got a second chance.
You're just happy that you're alive.
I want to thank you for everything you've done. I admire you for that. And for coming here.
Very welcome.
Thank you.
Everybody always says if this, were going to happen, it couldn't have happened to a better person.
Hailing out of 1st Platoon, the 411th MP Company. Standing about 5'4", car, 125 pounds soaking wet, Anderson. Specialist Anderson, let's hear it for the fighters.
Tell me what happened first.
It was probably around 11 when it actually happened. I was driving, and me and my team leader, his name's Kenny, we always sit there and talk and bullshit and, you know, make fun of everything that we're doing and, you know, just trying to keep a sense of humor so we keep our mind off being scared.
So wait, how are you feeling today on this wonderful day?
Just great knowing that our wonderful platoon sergeant is coming back to make their life a living hell today.
Yes, I cannot wait either.
And if I remember correctly, I was smoking. I had my left hand on the steering wheel. I was smoking, and then the bomb went off. I didn't hear it, but I saw it, like the flash and the smoke and the fire coming through the door. And I realized we got hit, so I was like, oh, we got hit. And then I had blood on my face and the flies were landing all over my face, so I wiped my face to get rid of the flies. And that's when I noticed that my fingertip was gone. So I was like, oh, okay. And that's when I started really assessing myself. I was like, all right, that's not bad. And then I turned my hand over, I noticed like this piece of, you know, this chunk of my hand was gone. So I was like, okay, still not bad. I can live with that. And then when I went to wipe the flies from my face again with my left hand, there was nothing there. So that's when I was like, oh, you know, that's gone. And then I looked down and I saw that my legs were gone. And then they had kind of forced my head back to the ground so that hoping that I wouldn't see, you know.
What was your immediate reaction to that?
Well, I was just kind of like, oh shit. This is, you know, obviously my left leg. That's what I have left of it. This one's a lot shorter than my other one. And this is the surgery mark, and then all down here is the actual, you know, sewing line from the injury. They folded it up and put it there. And then my arm just kind of goes into the socket to about here.
And your hand? What's that? Do that again?
I can spin it all the way around. You can open and close it, and that's pretty much all it does.
Can you take my hand? Would that be a problem?
No, because I'm...
Well, you can control that very well.
Yeah, pretty much. If I didn't have my hand, if I lost both my hands, I really think, you know, it wouldn't be worth it to be around. Only because to have both your legs gone and both your hands gone would be 1,000 times more difficult.
Maybe a sensation of touch, too, in a sense.
Right. Why I can't feel these 3 fingers either.
Well.
But it's slowly coming back, so I'm very hopeful. But I can still pick up a fork and feed myself and you know, clean myself up in the shower or whatever.
So it's about being independent.
Yeah, it has to do a lot with being independent.
Have you heard about that? A lot of people have said that you now have two birthdays.
Yes, the alive day.
The day that you were born and the day that you almost died and you were alive.
Right.
Do you have any feelings on that? Or?
For right now, I'm sure it'll change in the future. But for right now, I feel that your alive day, everybody makes a big deal about it, especially at Walter Reed, all the therapists, and they're like, oh, it's your alive day, congratulations. And I can see their point, that you would want to celebrate something like that. But from my point of view, it's like, okay, well, we're sitting here celebrating the worst day of my life. Great. Let's just remind me of that every year. I don't know.
What day was, what was the day?
October 23rd of 05.
All right. 40 surgeries in 13 months. I can't even imagine what it's like to go through something like that. But this is one of the consequences of these wars, especially with the IEDs. I don't know how Gandolfini did it, but he had insurgent footage, that shows the Humvee going down the road and then detonating an IED. But we'll entertain any questions you have about that maybe later on, but let me just go through some more information here about the potential that human beings have of being empathic to the extreme. In other words, their willingness to suffer without the desire for retaliation. Okay? This is a hard thing. That's a lifetime effort. So here's an example of written language. 5,000 years ago in the Middle East. Yep, human beings had the genetic potential for 200,000 years prior to the first invention of written language. And if you read some of the more current anthropological literature, what they're saying, archaeological literature, that we had that capacity, we had that empathic capacity like built into our genome way back. Not just a million years, but maybe as many as 30 million or 29 million or 27, it was there because of the dynamics of the small band gather hunter groups and the social interactions that they had with one another. Another is reading. 1,000 years ago, 1% of the population of Western Europe could read, and now almost everyone can read. It's universal, but it's universal public education that made that possible. So we have genes. We have genes that we can express. We have genes that actually control our behaviors depending upon what that gene is developing as far as the brain is concerned or our peripheral nervous system is concerned. And we just assume that because of the dominant effect of not only religious organizations, but also the evolutionary psychology that's out there now saying that we are innately mean and greedy and violent and aggressive, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things the most recent book did from this field of study, anthropology, archaeology, was that it definitively proved there was no such thing as a war gene. Steven Pinker wrote a book, Our Better Angels, a couple years ago, and that's one of the things that he was talking about. We have a war gene. And there is no such thing. Absolutely no such thing. And this is an example of what can happen if you deprive someone of experiences. So I don't know if you can read that or not, but if not, I'll just go through it quickly and just summarize what's there. And there were studies that isolated infants, normal infants, and deprived them of certain experiences. And this particular one was language. So eventually, when people realized how disastrous it was, they called it the forbidden experience, simply because of the exceptional deprivation of ordinary human contact it requires. And we'll take a look at Frederick in a minute, but he raised Well, he didn't raise them himself, but he had foster mothers and nurses raise children and deprive the children of language. And we'll see the results of that particular experiment are concerned. So he labored in vain, and one of the reasons for that was because, the kids weren't receiving any kind of feedback. So you know how we clap for our grandkids or even our older kids at a sporting event, and have all kinds of hand gestures that indicate, what we're feeling or how we want to interact. And the gladness, blandishments, these praises we lavish on our children or people we love. So it was eventually concluded that speech arose from hearing human speech. And if you couldn't hear human speech, you would be mute. But this comes from a little background research we did after we had conducted a veterans end-of-life stories study. We did it in conjunction with the University of Delaware and Delaware Hospice. And I was volunteering for Delaware Hospice at the time, and they wanted to know if I would kind of spearhead this because I was a vet. So we started looking at what effect, this is what they wanted to know, what effect would telling their story have on end-of-life experiences for the vet? Would he feel more peaceful? Would he feel he had resolved conflicts? Would he possibly heal wounds between himself and other members of his family or friends, etc., etc.? So when we started looking at the literature, the results were really profound. There was absolutely no doubt that the vet benefited from it, but not only that, but the caregiver. Because they heard the story. We taped it. Some of the interviews last an hour or 2 hours. We would go in, and we went one day to a man who had Parkinson's disease and severe, and his wife said, I don't think he's going to go more than 15 minutes. I said, that's okay, we can come back. So we record the interviews, and he was still talking after 2 hours. So, this was important for him to tell his story, and he did. So then we made a CD, and we gave the family the CD as well as a transcript so they have some kind of legacy in the family for people that want to understand what their grandfather went through or their father went through. So through language, individual brains are able to communicate with the minds of others, through shared stories. So this is a kind of a union of the mind, so to speak. And what this does is not incidental. So there's a neural integration that takes place, and neural integration is one of the most important processes that takes place in the brain. There was a researcher at the MindSight Institute in California. His name was Dan Siegel. He's a child psychiatrist, MD. He went through the DSM-4, and he said that every psychological disorder that was listed in the DSM-4, which is the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual for Psychological Disorders, he said every one you could trace back to lack of neural integration. And he said one of the most important things that human beings could do to integrate the brain is to actually participate in activities like breath awareness or MindSight meditation or centering prayer, because there are 9 functions of the middle prefrontal cortex that actually increase in size and functionality as a result of participating in those activities, and we'll talk about those this afternoon. So you can change brain structure, brain chemistry simply by participating in certain kinds of activities. You participate in war and you have brain structure and brain chemistry that's changed in a different way, the very negative way. And then emotional regulation and enhanced executive function. This is the very pinnacle of brain functioning, these executive functions that the human brain has the capacity to enter into. Now, when we did the course at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, they were actually integrating neuroscience and anthropology. So they invited different speakers to come in, and I did the neuroscience and nonviolence. And one of the things that we talked about in class was empathy. So we came up with this little thing. This is not real, this is just contrived. But in the 21st century, these are students, some of them are seniors, some of them are freshmen, some of them were pre-med, some of them were anthropology, some of them were other domains of higher education. dominated the planet. The underlying way of being that permeated this historic period was imbued with an unremitting display of kindness, mercy, and compassion by and for all its citizens. And so they signed it Citizens of the Planet Earth 2050. This is when this article was written. It was called Progenitors. They imagined them to be part of this. Progenitors of a universal commitment to living and sustaining an empathic consciousness. And this was published in the journal Empathic Way 1-1, issue 1, volume 1. So it was just some thought, they had about after we discussed empathy and the impact it could have on culture and society and development. So this is the key thing. Out of everything that I talk about now in this afternoon is related to this phenomenon. That is, the human brain is an internal representation of the external environment. So what do we mean by that? First of all, neurons are designed to change. They're designed to change in response to patterned, repetitive stimulation. If you took typing lessons, ASDF, semicolon, LKJ, that's where you start out. And then gradually, you know where those keys are. The more you repeat it, the easier it gets to remember them until finally it's spontaneous. You don't even need to think about it. In fact, when you hit the wrong key, you already know it, and then you go back and correct it because now you're familiar with the keyboard and your brain knows that you miskeyed, a certain letter or symbol. So designed to change in response to patterned repetitive stimulation, and it changes the patterns of neural activity. So just imagine this is one of the 10 areas of the brain, and you're out helping the poor, you're out being compassionate to someone, you're providing medical care, you're providing counseling. As you participate in that, those areas of the brain that are integrating that particular function with other areas of the brain, because now you have neural networks communicating with one another, so it's not just one area. You're going to have a lot of things going on just about that person and how you internally feel about that. So this in adults, this alters pre-existing neural organization. So if you want to change your existing neural organization, then you need to, as we well know, to participate in activities that are patterned and repetitive. Sometimes very boring. So this is the basis for learning and memory. And the important thing to remember here is the more a neural system is activated, the more that neural system represents or resembles or changes to reflect that pattern of activation. So as you use these circuits become adapted to certain responses, and it becomes easier and more facile, to actually elicit those responses. It could be a basketball, it could be throwing a football, it could be hugging someone, it could be changing a wound dressing, just a number of things. So the more you do that, the more you interact with the individual, the better you get to know them. There's a whole dynamic now that's going on other than actually the physical changing of the bandage or giving the person food. Because neuroscience now knows that there is no memory without emotion and no emotion without memory. So what you're feeling from here down while you're nursing or caring for someone is as much a part of your perception of awareness as what you're actually cognitively being made aware of in your brain. So when you interact with someone, it's the face that incorporates the greatest percentage of that interaction. What's going on with that person's face? What's going on with your face? And they really have this worked out. They got all the muscles in the face worked out, and they know if someone gives you a service smile, like, someone's waiting on you, they give you this regular, or it's a genuine smile. They can tell by just taking a photograph, or the people that are trained to do it, like that lab at Berkeley, they know. And so they call it a service smile, and the scientists that actually discovered what muscles were different and when they contracted during that kind of smile, his name was Duchenne, so they call it Duchenne's smile. Now, this is the most important piece of everything that I talk about in this little section right here. Now, in the infant or child during development. So what we're talking about over here is we're talking about altering pre-existing neural organizations. We have all kinds of complexities set up here. And if we want to change that, we can just engage these pattern repetitive activities, and that activity will be enough to change the brain. It'll change the chemistry of the brain. It will also change the structure of the brain. So, in the child, in the infant during development, it defines the patterns of synaptic connectivity. Now, the synapse is the kind of the point at which neurons come close enough to communicate with one another. They don't actually touch one another, so that's called a synapse. That little space between the end of one neuron and the beginning of another is called the synapse. So it defines the patterns of synaptic connectivity. That is, child doesn't have this area developed at all. And now what you're doing is you're giving the child input, either visually, audio input. You're giving them a sense of your actual facial expression so they can see that. So you have the visual part and the auditory part, the way you talk to them, the speak, tone of voice, humming, singing, whatever you do with the child. You're actually defining patterns of neural activity when you do that. And so literally, it provides an organizational template for neural systems. So if we go back and we think about what I talked about when we were discussing the possibility of abuse and neglect early on, and that having an effect on the child, becoming an adolescent and then being so depressed or so distraught about their situation in life that they took their own life. Some of that starts back here. And so they don't have the networks, they don't have the neurochemistry that allows them to deal with stress and make it through that in a way that's constructive rather than destructive. So this determines functional capacity. So this is the child here. You're talking about infant, children during development, defining the pattern of how these neurons associate with one another. I mean, you're developing families of neurons that are going to be controlling very important processes that go on in your mind just by the way you're reacting to this child or the way the environment is impinging on the child. So you're deciding, how this goes. You're actually doing the wiring. You're hardwiring the child's brain. Not that can't be changed later, but once it's there, and if it's a negative thing, you have to do a lot to change that. So you develop corollary pathways, and as a result of diminishing the activity of this fear pathway, you can actually have the connections between some of those neurons actually fade so that they don't have the power that they had before you entered into this intermediary kind of activity that allowed you to change. So this is why, if a child is neglected early on and now they have a consistent caregiver because they've been adopted or they've come into another environment or there's been a change in the attitude and behavior of the caregivers that are surrounding that child, then these early issues have a chance, to be remediated. But some of them, once they really get hardwired in, are very hard to change. And one of the examples of that is the epigenetic thing where your behavior toward the child actually alters the expression of a gene. And I don't know how reversible that is, what the plasticity of that is. Somebody probably does, but I'm not sure about the possibility of reversing that kind of thing. So this is the functional capacity, and in the infant, it's not just learning and memory, it's actually development. So you're not using currently existing neural networks, you're actually developing neural networks. It's like if you had someone come in and wire your house, you wouldn't want someone to do it for the first time, had no idea what wiring was all about. And that's the distant caregiver. That person has no idea what the wiring process is. And so the interactions they have with a child are not the kinds of interactions they need to have with a child that develop the wiring to take place that's going to be efficient not only cognitively, emotionally, behaviorally, and motor. You know, the motor part is very closely associated with those other areas of development. And so the same thing, you know, the more a neural system is activated, the more that system changes to reflect that pattern of activation. So when you're 16 years old and you start to drive a car for the first time, unless you're like me, I used to sneak the car out of the garage when I was 15 and drive it around when my dad was at work and then put it back in the garage before I got back to work. So the day I turned 16, I said, could I go down and take my license? So anyway. All right. We are at lunchtime. What a nice place to stop. We'll look at Emily when we come back and this wonderful poem that she wrote. So let's break for lunch.